They bullied and shaved the obese girl's hair. As punishment, the mountain man makes them pay. The sun hung heavy over Dry Creek like molten copper, its heat pressing down on the dusty streets and weathered log cabins that comprised the small settlement on the edge of civilization. This was frontier country, where the law of the fist and the rifle held more weight than any paper decree from the distant federal capital. Here, in the Tennessee wilderness, strength determined survival, and the weak learned quickly to keep their heads down or perish. Among those who had learned this harsh lesson was a young woman the townspeople called simply the Fat Girl, though her Christian name was Martha Wellborn. She was a large woman by any measure, her frame heavy and round, her movements slow and careful, as if she carried the weight of the world upon her shoulders. Martha had come to Dry Creek 2 years prior with her father, a cooper who had died of fever, within 6 months of their arrival, leaving her alone in a town that had little mercy for the vulnerable. She worked as a laundress, taking in clothes from the few families who could afford such service, and she kept a small vegetable garden behind the lean-to shack she called home. Martha was quiet, soft-spoken, and kind to all who crossed her path, even those who mocked her. Her one vanity, her single treasure, was her hair, thick, chestnut brown, falling in heavy waves past her waist when she unbound it. She brushed it every night by candlelight, the one ritual that connected her to the mother she lost as a child, and the one thing that made her feel for just a moment beautiful. But beauty, like mercy, was in short supply in Dry Creek. 3 men made Martha's life particularly miserable: Silas Cobb, Vernon Pike, and Dutch Henry Voss. They were the self-appointed arbiters of the town's social order, each possessed of just enough wealth and meanness to make themselves feared. Silas ran the town's only trading post, Vernon owned a sprawling pig farm on the settlement's northern edge, and Dutch Henry made his living as a trapper and occasional enforcer when Silas needed someone hurt or scared. They were united by their love of whiskey, their sense of entitlement, and their particular brand of cruelty. They had tormented Martha since her arrival, calling out crude remarks when she walked past, throwing mud at her skirts, once even kicking over her wash bucket and ruining a week's worth of work. But Martha endured. She had nowhere else to go, no family to protect her, no means to leave. So she kept her head down, did her work, and tried to make herself invisible. On August 15th, 1793, her invisibility failed her. It was a Wednesday, market day, when the few scattered homesteaders from the surrounding wilderness came to trade goods and gossip. Martha had finished delivering a basket of clean laundry to the preacher's wife and was walking back toward her shack when she heard the drunken laughter spilling from behind Morrison's tavern. She quickened her pace, instinct warning her to avoid whatever mischief was brewing, but she wasn't quick enough. "Well, well, looky here," Silas Cobb drawled, stepping into her path. His face was flushed with drink, his eyes glassy and mean. Behind him, Vernon and Dutch Henry emerged from the tavern's shadow, forming a loose semicircle that cut off her escape. "Please, I don't want any trouble," Martha said quietly, clutching her empty basket to her chest like a shield. "No trouble at all," Vernon said, his voice oily with false cheer. "We just been talking, and we come to a decision. We decided this town's got standards, and you ain't meeting 'em. You're an eyesore," Dutch Henry added, his accent thick with the German his mother had taught him. A disgrace, walking around like you got a right to be seen. Before Martha could respond, before she could scream or run, they were on her. Silas grabbed one arm, Vernon the other, and they dragged her thrashing and crying toward the horse stable behind the tavern. Dutch Henry followed, pulling a long skinning knife from his belt and testing the edge with his thumb. "Hold her steady," he said. They bound her wrists to a hitching post with rough hemp rope that bit into her skin. She begged them to stop, her voice breaking with terror and desperation, but her pleas only seemed to excite them further. Dutch Henry grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back until tears streamed down her face. "This here's what we think of you," he said, bringing the knife to her scalp. What followed was an eternity of horror. The blade scraped and cut, careless of the tender skin beneath, as Dutch Henry sawed away great hanks of her precious hair. It fell in brown clumps to the dirt, mixing with her tears and the blood from where the knife nicked her scalp. Vernon and Silas laughed and passed a bottle between them, making crude jokes about shearing sheep and butchering hogs. When they finished, Martha's head was a patchy, ragged mess of stubble and raw skin. She sagged against the post, her sobs reduced to dry, hitching gasps. "There now," Silas said, untying her wrists. "That's better. Now you look as ugly on the outside as you are on the inside." They shoved her toward the main street, Dutch Henry delivering a final kick that sent her sprawling in the dust. "Walk home, pig girl," he called after her. "Let everyone see what happens to those who forget their place." Martha stumbled to her feet and ran, her hands covering her mutilated head, while behind her the three men's laughter echoed like the baying of wolves. Ezekiel Boone had been in the high country for 3 weeks, checking his trap lines and hunting bear in the limestone caves that riddled the eastern mountains. He was a legend in the Tennessee Territory, known to settlers and Cherokee alike as Boone the Bear, for his size, his strength, and his ferocity when roused. Standing 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox yoke and hands that could crush walnuts in their grip, he was a man built by the wilderness and for the wilderness. But Zeke, as he preferred to be called, was no mindless brute. He had been educated by Moravian missionaries as a boy, could read Latin and Greek, and possessed a thoughtful, philosophical temperament that often surprised those who knew him only by reputation. He had come to the frontier to escape the rigid social hierarchies of Virginia society, where his mixed Cherokee heritage, his mother had been the daughter of a prominent warrior, made him an object of suspicion and scorn. In the mountains, such distinctions mattered less. A man was judged by his skills, his courage, and his word. Zeke had proven himself in all 3 measures, and he had earned a grudging respect from even the most hardened frontiersmen. He rode into Dry Creek on August 18th, leading a pack horse laden with beaver pelts, bear grease, and a magnificent black bear hide he intended to trade for powder and shot. The town seemed quieter than usual, the normal bustle of commerce subdued, and Zeke felt a prickle of unease at the base of his skull. Something was wrong. He spotted Martha Wellborn sitting at the edge of the town well, her posture hunched and defeated. She wore a faded calico bonnet pulled low over her face, and even from a distance Zeke could see she was trembling. He knew Martha slightly. She had once mended a shirt for him, refusing payment and accepting only a haunch of venison in trade. She had struck him as kind and gentle, qualities too rare in the harsh frontier world. Zeke dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss Martha," he said quietly. She flinched at the sound of his voice and tried to turn away, but not before he caught a glimpse of her face, swollen from crying, her eyes hollow with shame and trauma. "Miss Martha, what happened?" Zeke asked, his voice hardening. "Nothing," she whispered, but her voice broke on the word. Zeke crouched beside her, bringing himself closer to her level. "Please," he said gently, "let me help." Slowly, hesitantly, Martha lifted her hands and removed the bonnet. Zeke's jaw clenched so hard he heard his teeth grind. Her beautiful hair was gone, hacked away in a brutal, humiliating assault. Patches of scalp showed raw and inflamed, and dried blood crusted the worst of the cuts. "Who did this?" Zeke asked, his voice gone cold and flat. Martha shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter," she said. "They'll just hurt me worse if I tell." "Tell me their names," Zeke said. Something in his tone, a promise of protection, of justice, of terrible retribution, made Martha meet his eyes. And in those dark, gentle eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen from anyone in Dry Creek. Genuine rage on her behalf. "Silas Cobb," she whispered, "Vernon Pike, Dutch Henry Voss." Zeke stood, his full height seeming to blot out the sun. "Go home, Miss Martha," he said quietly. "Lock your door. Don't come out until I come for you." "What are you going to do?" she asked, fear and hope warring in her voice. Zeke's expression was carved from stone. "What should have been done the moment they touched you?" he said, and turned toward Morrison's tavern. Silas, Vernon, and Dutch Henry were exactly where Zeke expected to find them, in the tavern's back room, drinking rot-gut whiskey and playing cards with the easy confidence of men who had never faced real consequences for their actions. They were regaling a few other patrons with the story of their prank, embellishing the details to make themselves seem even more daring. "Should have seen her run," Vernon was saying, his words slurred, "like a stuck pig squealing for—" The door exploded inward with a crack like thunder. Zeke filled the frame, having kicked the heavy oak portal off its leather hinges with a single blow. Silence crashed down on the room like a fallen tree. "Which of you cut her?" Zeke asked. For a moment no one moved. Then Silas, emboldened by drink and the presence of witnesses, sneered. "That's none of your concern, Boone," he said. "Girl needed teaching. We just provided the lesson." "Stand up," Zeke said. "Go to hell," Dutch Henry spat, reaching for the flintlock pistol at his belt. He never cleared leather. Zeke crossed the distance between them in two massive strides, caught Dutch Henry by the throat, and lifted him clear off his feet. The German's face turned purple, his hand scrabbling uselessly at Zeke's iron grip as the mountain man carried him across the room and slammed him against the log wall hard enough to knock a deer skull from its peg. "Next man who reaches for a weapon dies," Zeke said conversationally to the room at large. Vernon Pike made the mistake of testing that promise. He snatched up his rifle from where it leaned against the card table, but Zeke released Dutch Henry, who collapsed gasping to the floor, and caught Vernon's weapon mid-swing. He wrenched it from Vernon's hands, reversed it, and brought the stock crashing down on the pig farmer's knee. The crack of splintering bone was audible throughout the tavern, and Vernon's scream was nearly as loud. Silas Cobb tried to run. Zeke's hand shot out, caught him by the back of his collar, and dragged him backward with such force that Silas's feet left the ground. Zeke hurled him into the card table, which collapsed under the impact, sending coins and cards flying. "All three of you," Zeke said, breathing hard but controlled, are going to learn what it feels like to be helpless. What followed became legend in Dry Creek, a story told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. Zeke dragged all three men, Silas conscious and pleading, Vernon whimpering and cradling his shattered knee, Dutch Henry still gasping for air, out into the street. A crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the commotion, and Zeke made no effort to hide what he was doing. He wanted witnesses. He bound their hands behind their backs with their own belts and forced them to kneel in the dirt of the main street. Then he retrieved Dutch Henry's skinning knife, still matted with Martha's hair, from the German's belt. "This is the blade you used," Zeke said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Now you'll learn what it feels like." "You can't do this," Silas shrieked. "It ain't legal. It ain't right." "Neither was what you did to her," Zeke replied calmly. He grabbed Silas by the hair and began to cut. It was not a clean shave, not a barber's careful work. Zeke used the same rough, careless strokes that Dutch Henry had used on Martha, scraping the knife across scalp until blood beaded on the skin. Silas screamed and begged, but Zeke was merciless. When he finished, Silas's head was a red, patchy ruin. Vernon was next, sobbing and vomiting from pain and fear, and finally Dutch Henry, who maintained a sullen silence until the blade touched his skull, at which point he broke and wept like a child. When all three were shorn and bleeding, Zeke stood before them. "Now," he said, "you're going to apologize." "We're sorry!" Vernon wailed immediately. "We're sorry! We're sorry! Please don't hurt us no more." "Not to me," Zeke said coldly. "To her." He gestured, and the crowd parted. Martha Wellborn stood at the edge of the gathering, her face pale, but her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been fierce, vindicated joy. "Go on," Zeke said to the three men. "Tell her what you did. Tell her you're sorry. Tell her you'll never touch her or anyone else again." One by one, through tears and blood and shame, they did. Silas's voice was barely audible. Vernon couldn't stop sobbing long enough to form complete sentences. Dutch Henry spoke in German, and then, at Zeke's prompting, in broken English, each word torn from him like a tooth being pulled. When they finished, Zeke turned to the crowd. "If anyone in this town ever harms Miss Martha again," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "I will do worse than this. I will bury you so deep in these mountains that not even the crows will find your bones. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Zeke cut the men's bonds and let them stumble away, broken and humiliated. Then he walked to Martha and gently placed a soft doe-skin cloth in her hands. "It's clean," he said quietly, "for your head, until your hair grows back." Martha looked up at him, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. In the days that followed, Zeke found reasons to visit Dry Creek more frequently than his usual pattern of month-long absences. He brought Martha gifts, a fine ivory comb carved from elk antler, a blue ribbon he'd traded for at a Cherokee village, a small mirror in a wooden frame, each one chosen with careful thought. He told himself he was simply ensuring her continued safety, that his presence would deter any further harassment. But the truth, which took him longer to acknowledge, was simpler and more profound. He had fallen in love. It happened gradually, in the quiet moments they spent together. Martha invited him to share meals at her small table, and they would talk for hours, about books, about the frontier, about their dreams and fears. Zeke discovered that Martha possessed a sharp wit and a deep well of kindness that had survived despite all the cruelty she'd endured. She, in turn, saw past his fearsome reputation to the gentle, thoughtful man beneath. "Why did you help me?" she asked him one evening as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. They were sitting on the split log bench outside her cabin, watching the sun set over the western ridges. Zeke considered the question carefully. "Because what they did was wrong," he said finally. "Because no one else would stand for you. Because—" He paused, struggling for words. "Because you deserved better." Martha reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and pale against his weathered, scarred knuckles. "Thank you," she said simply. Zeke looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking on a spring river. "Martha," he said, and his voice was hoarse, "I wonder if, that is, I would like to—" He faltered, suddenly uncertain. He had faced down bears and hostile war parties, without flinching, but asking this small, brave woman the question burning in his heart terrified him more than any physical danger. Martha squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said, smiling. "You don't know what I was going to ask," Zeke protested, but he was smiling too. "Yes, I do," Martha said, "and my answer is yes." They were married that winter by the circuit preacher, in a ceremony attended by nearly everyone in Dry Creek. The three men who had tormented Martha were conspicuously absent. Silas had sold his trading post and moved to Kentucky. Vernon had become a recluse on his pig farm, and Dutch Henry had disappeared into the mountains and was rumored to have joined a Cherokee band. No one mourned their departure. Zeke built Martha a proper cabin on a beautiful piece of bottomland 5 miles from Dry Creek, near a clear stream that sang over smooth stones. It was a fine structure, built with care and skill. 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, glass windows hauled all the way from Knoxville, and a covered porch where Martha could sit and watch the mountains. He furnished it with pieces he made himself or traded for, a sturdy bed frame, a table of smooth oak, chairs with woven seats, and even a bookshelf for the small collection of books they were slowly accumulating. Martha transformed the cabin into a home. She planted a garden that grew vegetables and herbs, kept chickens for eggs, and made the interior warm and welcoming, with colorful quilts and curtains she sewed herself. Her hair grew back slowly, and though it never again reached the length it had been, she wore it proudly, often decorated with wild flowers or the ribbons Zeke brought her. Zeke, for his part, found that domestic life suited him better than he'd expected. He still trapped and hunted, but he always returned to Martha and the cabin with a sense of homecoming he'd never known before. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, Martha sewing or reading aloud while Zeke carved or repaired his equipment, and talk about their days. "I never thought I'd have this," Martha confessed one night, nearly a year after their wedding. "A home, safety, someone who loves me." Zeke set aside the knife he was sharpening and pulled her close. "You deserve all of it," he said fiercely. "You deserve the world." Martha rested her head against his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I have everything I need," she said. In the spring of 1795, Martha gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Zeke's mother. She was a healthy, robust baby, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle temperament. Zeke held his daughter for the first time with hands that could break a man's bones, and he wept with joy. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Martha, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at him. "Just like her father," she said. Zeke proved to be a devoted father, carrying Sarah in a cradleboard on his back when he checked nearby trap lines, teaching her to identify animal tracks and bird calls before she could walk steadily, singing her Cherokee lullabies his mother had taught him. Martha watched them together with a full heart, marveling at the gentleness in this mountain of a man. 2 years later, a son arrived, a boy they named Daniel, who was loud and energetic from his first breath. He would grow to be as tall as his father, with the same broad shoulders and quiet strength, though he inherited his mother's kindness and empathy. The cabin rang with laughter and love, the sounds of a family thriving against all odds. Neighbors who had once ignored Martha now sought her advice on medicine and midwifery, for she had a gift for healing. Zeke became a respected figure in the growing settlement, a man whose word carried weight and whose sense of justice, though fierce, was always fair. One morning, in the autumn of 1798, 5 years after the incident that had changed Martha's life, Silas Cobb returned to Dry Creek. He was a changed man, gaunt, broken, ravaged by drink and guilt. He came to Martha and Zeke's cabin and stood at the edge of their property, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. Zeke saw him first and felt the old anger rise in his chest. But Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let me," she said quietly. She walked out to meet Silas, and Zeke followed at a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. But there was no need. "Miss Martha," Silas said, his voice rough and broken, "I know I got no right to be here. I know what I'd done was unforgivable, but I've been carrying it with me every day since, and it's eaten me up inside. I needed you to know I'm sorry, truly sorry, for what I did and what I was." Martha studied him for a long moment. She saw not the cruel, drunken man who had tormented her, but a hollow shell consumed by remorse. She thought of all she had gained since that terrible day: a loving husband, beautiful children, a life full of purpose and joy, and she realized that holding on to anger would only poison what she had built. "I forgive you," she said simply. Silas looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. "How?" he asked. "How can you?" Martha smiled, and it was genuine. "Because hate takes too much energy," she said, "and I'd rather spend mine on love." She turned and walked back to where Zeke stood with their children. Silas watched them for a moment. The mountain man who had become a father, the woman he'd tormented who had become strong and whole. And then he left. He was never seen in Dry Creek again, but those who knew him said he spent the rest of his days trying to make amends for his past. The years passed gently for Zeke and Martha. Sarah grew into a capable young woman who married a farmer's son and started her own family just 2 miles from her parents' home. Daniel apprenticed with a blacksmith in Knoxville, but returned every summer to help his father with the heavy work around the homestead. Martha's hair, now streaked with silver, fell to her shoulders, and she wore it loose on special occasions, remembering but no longer haunted by what had been taken from her. She had become a pillar of the community, respected and beloved, her past suffering transformed into a deep well of compassion for others who struggled. Zeke, though age had silvered his beard and lined his face, remained formidable. But those who knew him best saw how he had softened, how love and family had tempered the wild edge of his nature without diminishing his strength. He still ventured into the high country occasionally, but he always came home to Martha, to the cabin they'd built together, to the life they'd created from ashes and pain. On a warm evening in 1810, they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had sheltered them for so many years. Their children were grown and gone, the cabin quiet except for the chorus of evening birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. "Do you ever think about that day?" Martha asked, her hand in Zeke's. "The day everything changed?" Zeke considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not with regret. That day brought me to you." Martha leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as darkness crept across the valley. She thought about the frightened, broken girl she'd been and the strong, loved woman she'd become. She thought about the cruelty of the world and the power of one person who chose to stand against it. "Zeke," she said softly. Thank you," she said, "for everything." He squeezed her hand gently. "No, Martha," he said. "Thank you. You taught me what it means to be truly strong, not through force, but through forgiveness, through choosing love when hate would be easier." They remained there until the stars emerged, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful from the ruins of cruelty. In the distance, a wolf howled, and closer, an owl called to its mate. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to their story, a story of pain and justice, of love and redemption, of two people who had defied the harsh laws of the frontier to create their own law, the law of compassion, of strength in service of the vulnerable, of two hearts beating as one. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.